Something extremely dangerous is happening right now beneath the surface of the global order, and most people still do not understand how close the world may be to a geopolitical rupture unlike anything we have seen since the height of the Cold War. Because this is no longer simply about Iran. It is no longer simply about Ukraine. It is no longer simply about Taiwan. What we are witnessing now is the convergence of multiple strategic crises into one interconnected global confrontation between declining American dominance and a rapidly consolidating Eurasian power structure centered around Russia and China. And if you stay with me until the end of this analysis, I'm going to explain why what appears on the surface to be disconnected tensions are actually pieces of the same strategic transformation. A transformation that could alter the global balance of power permanently if Washington continues miscalculating the intentions, capabilities, and patience of its adversaries. Now, let me say something immediately that many politicians and television analysts are unwilling to admit publicly. The United States no longer possesses the uncontested leverage it enjoyed after the collapse of the Soviet Union. That era is over, completely over. But the American political establishment has not psychologically accepted this reality yet, and that disconnect between reality and perception is becoming extraordinarily dangerous because it creates a pattern of strategic overreach based on assumptions that no longer match the world as it actually exists. And nowhere is that disconnect more obvious right now than in Washington's simultaneous confrontation with Russia, China, and Iran. Now understand something important here. During the unipolar era after 1991, American policymakers became accustomed to operating inside a world where economic sanctions, military pressure, financial coercion, technological dominance, and alliance systems could eventually force most adversaries into submission, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly. But ultimately, the assumption was always the same. America possessed enough economic and military superiority to dictate the strategic boundaries of global politics. But what happens when major powers stop accepting those boundaries? That's the question driving everything now. And if you think that sounds theoretical, let me explain what has changed operationally over the last decade. Russia rebuilt strategic military capabilities after years of post-Soviet collapse. China transformed itself from a manufacturing platform into a technological, industrial, naval, and economic superpower. Iran adapted to sanctions pressure by decentralizing production, developing indigenous missile industries, expanding drone warfare capabilities, and building asymmetric regional influence structures capable of surviving sustained pressure. These are not isolated developments. They are interconnected reactions to decades of American pressure. And this is where things become extremely dangerous because Washington still behaves as if these powers remain strategically isolated from one another, when in reality American policy has gradually pushed them closer together than at any point in modern history. Now stay with me because this next point is absolutely critical if you want to understand why the current geopolitical environment feels so unstable. During the Cold War, the United States successfully exploited divisions between Moscow and Beijing. Strategic triangular diplomacy became one of Washington's greatest geopolitical advantages. Nixon and Kissinger understood something very important. A divided Eurasia strengthened American global dominance. A united Eurasia threatened it. That logic never stopped being true. But over the last 20 years, American strategic pressure accelerated exactly the opposite outcome. NATO expansion, sanctions regimes, trade wars, technology restrictions, military encirclement strategies, regime change operations, financial weaponization. All of these policies convinced Russia and China that long-term strategic cooperation was no longer optional for survival. And once that realization crystallized, the geopolitical map began changing rapidly. Now think carefully about what this means militarily. Russia possesses enormous natural resources, nuclear parity with the United States, advanced missile technologies, strategic depth, and battlefield experience. China possesses industrial scale unlike anything the modern world has ever seen, expanding naval power, technological momentum, and economic reach across multiple continents simultaneously. Iran possesses strategic geography, controlling critical energy corridors and one of the most sophisticated asymmetric warfare doctrines in the region. Individually, these powers create challenges. Together, they create a systemic challenge to American global dominance itself. That's the real story unfolding now. And if you think policymakers in Washington fully understand the scale of this transformation, I'm not convinced they do. Because much of the American foreign policy establishment still psychologically operates according to assumptions formed during the height of post-Cold War unipolar confidence. The belief that economic pressure alone can force compliance. The belief that sanctions inevitably weaken adversaries faster than they weaken alliance cohesion. The belief that technological superiority automatically guarantees strategic superiority. But the battlefield realities emerging across multiple theaters are increasingly contradicting those assumptions. Now let me explain why Taiwan sits at the center of this larger confrontation. Taiwan is not simply an island dispute for Beijing. It is viewed inside Chinese strategic thinking as a core sovereignty issue tied directly to national legitimacy, historical humiliation, territorial integrity, and long-term security architecture in the Pacific. That distinction matters enormously because countries tolerate risk differently when they believe existential national interests are involved. And China clearly views Taiwan that way. This is not a bluff. It is not political theater. It is not negotiable in the way Western analysts often imagine. And this is where American strategic ambiguity becomes extraordinarily risky. Washington publicly speaks about one China policies while simultaneously expanding military integration, political engagement, weapons transfers, intelligence coordination, and strategic signaling toward Taiwan. In other words, the United States attempts to maintain deterrence through deliberate ambiguity while steadily moving operationally closer to de facto military alignment with Taipei. Beijing sees this very clearly. Now, if you think that's alarming, the next reality is even worse. China spent decades studying American warfare methods in Iraq, Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, and elsewhere. Chinese military planners concluded that direct symmetrical confrontation with the United States would be strategically foolish. So instead, they focused on anti-access and area denial systems specifically designed to make American intervention in the Western Pacific prohibitively costly. Missile saturation, naval targeting systems, integrated air defense, cyber warfare, industrial scaling, shipbuilding dominance, long-range precision strike capability, all of it designed around one objective, making the Pacific too dangerous for uncontested American power projection. And this is where the mathematics become uncomfortable for Washington, because modern warfare increasingly revolves around industrial sustainability and production capacity rather than simply technological spectacle. China produces ships at rates the United States currently cannot match. China graduates enormous numbers of engineers annually. China controls critical supply chains involving rare earth minerals, battery systems, manufacturing infrastructure, and advanced industrial components essential for modern military production. That matters now more than ever, because prolonged confrontation is ultimately sustained by industrial ecosystems, not television rhetoric. And if you think this only affects military calculations, you're missing the larger economic dimension entirely. The global economy itself has become deeply dependent on Chinese manufacturing networks and resource processing chains, rare earth minerals, electronics production, battery technology, shipping infrastructure, industrial components, pharmaceuticals, consumer manufacturing. The list is enormous. Now ask yourself one simple question. How does the United States sustain prolonged strategic confrontation against the very industrial ecosystem modern Western economies remain deeply dependent upon? That's the dilemma policymakers increasingly face. And this is where Iran re-enters the picture in a much larger way than most people realize. Iran sits geographically at the intersection of critical energy corridors connecting the Middle East, Central Asia, Russia, China, and maritime trade routes. Beijing understands this perfectly. Moscow understands this perfectly. Which is why Iran is no longer viewed merely as a regional issue, but increasingly as part of a broader Eurasian strategic architecture resisting Western pressure. Now stay with me because this next part explains why the current moment feels so unstable globally. The Ukraine war accelerated strategic consolidation between Russia and China dramatically. Sanctions intended to isolate Moscow instead accelerated alternative financial systems, energy realignments, technological cooperation, and military coordination mechanisms outside Western control. In other words, pressure intended to fracture Eurasian powers increasingly pushed them toward deeper integration. That is a massive strategic failure Washington still struggles to acknowledge publicly. Because sanctions work best when adversaries remain isolated. But Russia did not remain isolated. China did not abandon Russia. Iran did not collapse. Instead, new trading mechanisms emerged. Energy partnerships expanded. Military cooperation deepened, and perhaps most importantly, trust between Moscow and Beijing strengthened through shared confrontation with Western pressure systems. Now think carefully about how dangerous this becomes from a global stability perspective. The United States is simultaneously attempting to manage confrontation with Russia in Europe, deter China in the Pacific, pressure Iran in the Middle East, sustain alliance cohesion under inflationary pressure, rebuild military stockpiles after massive expenditures, and preserve dollar dominance while global fragmentation accelerates. That is an enormous strategic burden, especially during a period when domestic political polarization inside the United States itself is intensifying rapidly. And this is where things become truly historic. Because periods of global transition are often defined by one dangerous pattern. Declining powers struggle psychologically to accept limitations, while rising powers become increasingly unwilling to tolerate old structures of dominance. That collision creates instability across every domain simultaneously: military, economic, technological, financial, diplomatic. We may already be entering that phase now, and if you think world leaders are calmly managing these tensions behind closed doors, I think you underestimate how much uncertainty currently exists inside global strategic planning circles. Because beneath the public rhetoric, military planners around the world are increasingly confronting uncomfortable realities about stockpile depletion, industrial limitations, economic vulnerability, energy dependence, escalation control, and alliance reliability during prolonged confrontation scenarios. Those concerns are real, very real. Now let me tell you what may be the most dangerous aspect of all this. Nuclear deterrence historically imposed restraint because major powers understood escalation could become catastrophic for everyone involved. But modern geopolitical competition increasingly occurs inside gray zones below direct nuclear thresholds. Sanctions, cyber warfare, proxy conflicts, maritime pressure, economic disruption, information warfare, industrial competition. The problem is that gray zone conflicts can still spiral, especially when multiple theaters begin interacting simultaneously. Ukraine affects Europe, Taiwan affects Pacific trade routes, Iran affects energy markets, sanctions affect global inflation. Military spending affects domestic economies. Everything is connected now. And if you think that's alarming, you still haven't reached the most dangerous possibility yet. Because the longer these pressures accumulate without stable diplomatic frameworks capable of managing them, the greater the risk that one regional crisis suddenly triggers chain reactions across multiple strategic theaters at the same time. That's how global wars become possible. Not always through deliberate planning, but through cascading escalation between powers already operating under extreme pressure, mutual distrust, economic strain, and shrinking room for political compromise. And right now, the world is moving dangerously close to that kind of environment. Now, here is where this situation becomes even more dangerous, because once multiple great powers begin believing that time itself is working against them, strategic patience starts collapsing. And when strategic patience collapses, the probability of miscalculation rises dramatically. That is one of the oldest and most dangerous patterns in geopolitical history. Nations under pressure begin accelerating decisions. Military postures harden, economic warfare intensifies, diplomatic flexibility shrinks, and eventually every regional crisis starts getting interpreted through the lens of global confrontation rather than isolated conflict management. That is exactly what we are beginning to see now. Because from Moscow's perspective, Ukraine is no longer merely about territory. It is about NATO expansion, strategic encirclement, regime survival, and the long-term balance of power in Europe. From Beijing's perspective, Taiwan is not simply an island dispute, but a test of whether China can fully emerge as a sovereign global power, free from American containment strategies. From Tehran's perspective, confrontation with Israel and the United States is increasingly viewed as part of a larger struggle against a regional order designed to permanently isolate and weaken Iran. Now think carefully about what happens when all three of those powers begin seeing their conflicts as interconnected. That's the nightmare scenario, because interconnected strategic thinking changes escalation behavior. Suddenly, support for allies becomes more important. Coordination increases. Intelligence sharing expands. Military cooperation deepens. Economic alignment accelerates. And the cost of backing down politically becomes much higher for everyone involved. This is why the Russia-China relationship matters so much right now. And I want people to understand something with absolute clarity before we go any further. What exists between Moscow and Beijing today is not some superficial diplomatic arrangement created for press conferences and photo opportunities. It is the result of decades of converging strategic interests accelerated by Western pressure. The United States spent years assuming it could simultaneously pressure Russia militarily, contain China economically, sanction Iran financially, and still prevent those powers from coordinating meaningfully with one another. That assumption may prove to be one of the greatest geopolitical miscalculations of the modern era, because what Washington failed to fully appreciate was that pressure creates adaptation, and adaptation creates alignment among states facing common threats. Russia needed markets, technology alternatives, and economic partnerships after sanctions. China needed energy security, strategic depth, and military cooperation as tensions with the United States escalated. Iran needed economic lifelines, military support networks, and geopolitical backing against isolation efforts. The result was inevitable. They moved closer together. Now stay with me, because what I'm about to explain is the part most mainstream discussions still fail to grasp. Modern great power competition is no longer primarily ideological the way it was during the Cold War. It is structural. Economic systems, supply chains, energy corridors, industrial production, technological ecosystems, resource security, financial architecture. Those are the foundations of 21st century power, and this is where the United States is beginning to encounter serious long-term challenges. Because for decades, American strategy assumed globalization itself would ultimately strengthen Western dominance permanently. Instead, globalization accelerated the industrial rise of strategic competitors while simultaneously hollowing out large sections of Western manufacturing resilience. Production chains became dependent on overseas infrastructure. Rare earth processing moved abroad. Industrial redundancy disappeared. Financialization replaced long-term industrial planning. That model worked during uncontested American dominance. It becomes much more fragile during systemic geopolitical confrontation. Now, if you think military superiority alone can solve those structural vulnerabilities, history suggests otherwise. Wars are sustained industrially before they are won militarily. Ammunition production matters. Shipbuilding capacity matters. Semiconductor manufacturing matters. Energy access matters. Transportation infrastructure matters. Logistics matter. Always. And this is where China's rise becomes strategically transformational. because Beijing understood very early that industrial scale itself could become geopolitical power. While much of the West prioritized financial expansion and short-term market efficiency, China focused relentlessly on manufacturing depth, infrastructure growth, technological acquisition, and long-term industrial planning. Now, the consequences of that strategy are becoming visible everywhere: shipbuilding, battery production, rare earth processing, consumer electronics, solar infrastructure, telecommunications, artificial intelligence, electric vehicles, advanced manufacturing systems. China is no longer simply participating in the global economy. It is increasingly shaping the industrial foundations of it. That reality terrifies policymakers in Washington because they understand something very uncomfortable privately. Economic interdependence limits military flexibility. The deeper global supply chains become tied to Chinese production capacity, the more difficult prolonged confrontation becomes economically for the West itself. And if you think that's alarming, the next development is even worse. Because Russia and China are not simply coordinating economically anymore. Increasingly, they are coordinating strategically around the idea of building alternative systems outside Western control altogether. Alternative payment systems, energy settlement mechanisms, trade corridors, development banks, currency diversification, technological cooperation. None of this replaces the Western financial system overnight, but it doesn't need to. It only needs to gradually weaken Western leverage over time, and that process may already be underway. Now let me explain why Iran matters so much inside this larger picture. Iran sits geographically at the crossroads of Eurasian integration, energy routes, maritime choke points, Central Asian access corridors, Middle Eastern influence networks. Iran is strategically positioned in ways many Americans still underestimate badly. This is why China invested heavily in long-term economic partnerships with Tehran. This is why Russia increasingly coordinates diplomatically and militarily with Iran. And this is why attempts to isolate Iran completely have repeatedly failed despite enormous pressure campaigns. Because Tehran is no longer operating inside a purely regional framework. It is increasingly connected to a much broader Eurasian geopolitical architecture emerging beneath the surface of the old international order. Now think carefully about what this means for future conflicts. The United States can no longer assume regional crises remain regionally contained. Pressure on Iran affects Chinese energy calculations. Escalation over Taiwan affects Russian strategic planning. NATO expansion affects Beijing's interpretation of American containment doctrine. Every theater increasingly influences the others simultaneously. That interconnectedness creates extraordinary instability, because modern crises no longer occur in isolation. And this is where the risk of wider war becomes genuinely serious. Not because leaders necessarily want global war deliberately, most do not, but because overlapping confrontations create cascading escalation risks. One crisis weakens economic stability. Economic instability increases political pressure. Political pressure encourages aggressive posturing. Aggressive posturing increases military tension. Military tension increases accident risk. Eventually, systems become overloaded. Now let me tell you what concerns military planners privately more than almost anything else right now. The world is entering a period where industrial competition, military modernization, economic fragmentation, technological rivalry, and geopolitical distrust are all accelerating simultaneously, while diplomatic trust mechanisms are weakening. That combination historically produces dangerous periods of instability. And unlike the Cold War, today's world lacks many of the stabilizing structures that eventually developed between Washington and Moscow after decades of nuclear brinkmanship. Arms control agreements are weaker, communication channels are less trusted, political polarization is more intense, information warfare distorts public understanding constantly, economic systems are more interconnected and therefore more vulnerable to disruption. All of that increases escalation risk. Now ask yourself one question. What happens if another major crisis erupts while all these pressures are already active simultaneously? That is the question terrifying serious strategic analysts right now, because the global system is already operating under enormous strain. Europe faces economic pressure and energy uncertainty. The United States faces political polarization and industrial challenges. China faces slowing growth and external containment pressure. Russia remains locked in prolonged confrontation with NATO. The Middle East remains unstable. Every major power is under stress at the same time. That's extremely dangerous historically. And if you think leaders can simply control escalation indefinitely once military confrontations intensify, history again suggests otherwise. Human beings make mistakes. Intelligence failures happen. Political pride interferes with rational calculation. Domestic pressure narrows diplomatic flexibility. Leaders become trapped by their own rhetoric. That's how catastrophic wars often begin, not through perfect strategic planning, but through accumulated miscalculation inside unstable systems already operating under pressure. Now stay with me, because this final point explains why the current moment feels different from previous geopolitical crises. For the first time since the end of the Cold War, the United States is confronting multiple major powers simultaneously that believe they possess both the capability and strategic necessity to resist American pressure long term. That changes the psychology of global politics entirely, because deterrence works differently once adversaries stop believing Western dominance is inevitable. Confidence changes, risk tolerance changes, strategic planning changes. Suddenly, powers become more willing to absorb sanctions, economic pain, diplomatic isolation, and prolonged confrontation if they believe the long-term balance of power is shifting in their favor. And increasingly, Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran appear to believe exactly that. Whether they are ultimately correct remains uncertain, but their confidence itself is strategically significant, because confidence shapes behavior. And right now, one of the most dangerous realities in global politics is that all sides increasingly believe the stakes are existential. Russia believes NATO expansion threatens long-term strategic survival. China believes containment threatens national reunification and future global status. Iran believes regional pressure threatens regime survival itself. Meanwhile, Washington increasingly views these powers collectively as threats to the international order America built after World War II. That is an extraordinarily combustible environment, because once major powers frame confrontation in existential terms, compromise becomes politically difficult and escalation becomes easier to justify domestically. And that is why the current geopolitical trajectory feels so dangerous. Not because world war is inevitable tomorrow morning, but because the structural pressures, strategic mistrust, military competition, economic fragmentation, and political psychology necessary for large-scale confrontation are all intensifying simultaneously. That is the real warning hidden beneath all the headlines right now. The world order itself is entering a period of profound instability, and history teaches us that periods like this rarely remain peaceful forever.